The Intercollegiate
Psychedelics Network. So we have Hannah, Jeremy, and Maya here today for the Q&A. And yeah, Mariano, Janelle, Agacia, and Shaylee, are not able to make it today to our live Q&A. So if you have a question for any of them, please type it out using the Q&A. Include your email address and we'll send it to them so they can follow up with you on our own time. So with that, I'm wondering if maybe we can do like just a quick round of intros again with a big takeaway of what your presentation was about. And then we have a few questions, but if you guys also have questions for each other, like go for it. So we can start anywhere. Let's start with Maya.
Hi, I'm Maya, and my talk was looking at dementia and using psychedelics to treat or prevent dementia and just kind of incorporating some perspectives from network neuroscience.
I can go next. My name's Jeremy, and my talk was on attitudes and perceptions of psilocybin among clinical trial personnel. And it was kind of the culmination of a project where I traveled around Europe and surveyed and interviewed personnel in 6 different cities, and kind of broadly asking them about like barriers and facilitators to patient outcomes, and then looking at like individual and like group differences with personnel type and how they sort of evaluated the effectiveness of clinical trials with psilocybin.
Hello, my name is Hannah Hilgeman, and I presented today on the topic of bipolar II depressive symptoms and the potential of psilocybin in treating those symptoms of depression in that patient population, and kind of talked about the risks and benefits of looking into doing clinical trials with that patient population, psilocybin.
Thank you guys so much for those reintroductions. We can start with a few questions for Maya specifically. So we were curious, you talked about mTOR activation sort of being potentially like something that we can consider that is sort of negative, and maybe a reason that we don't use it for dementia. mTOR is like all about energy metabolism within a cell. Can you like sort of like bridge the difference there of like how we go from like the cellular mechanism of like mTOR activation to this larger like network dedifferentiation you're talking about?
Yeah. So how to bridge those two, they aren't, I think, directly connected. Whenever I was preparing for this talk, I kind of just did a kind of wide look at different potential mechanisms and ones that can be beneficial and some that can be harmful. And one that I found that was briefly mentioned in one review of PsychedelX was actually, the review is written by Dr. Olson, who presented, I think, yesterday or so. And I kind of followed that rabbit hole and found that, and all of this was really new to me, so I'm by no means an expert in this area. I kind of focus more on the network neurosciences things, but mTOR, from what I understand it, kind of this mechanism that can teeter between fueling neuroplasticity and the growth of new dendrites and the growth of new neurons and stuff like that, or it can be more of like taking out the trash. So like the way that I kind of conceptualized it was like, I believe that when it's activated, I'm forgetting exactly if it's activation or inactivation that fuels it one way or another, but it either can be like taking out the trash or like adding a new room to your house is kind of like the way I conceived of it. And psychedelics can kind of help mTOR to like through mTOR fuel like the building of a new room to your house. But with Alzheimer's disease, whenever you're trying to build new things, this can actually start building pathological things and pathological plaques and tangles that can fuel neurodegeneration. And that's why it's one mechanism that can see the psychedelics is potentially harmful to Alzheimer's disease and other diseases like maybe Lewy body dementia or something like that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that clears up a lot. And I guess we can maybe like rotate between you guys so so we can, yeah, give everyone a chance. So I guess and then Erin, if you do want to pop in at any point, feel free. But I guess like for Jeremy, I don't know if like I missed this, but I was curious, sort of like 2 questions. What are your theories as to why like the whole COVID situation didn't change like perception among the personnel? And then did you see any differences like across the cities that you sort of studied?
Yeah, so my theory, and this was kind of echoed by, or my theory kind of evolved from the conversations that I had in the interviews, but people I think were able to find workarounds with COVID by using kind of a hybrid schedule. And also people seem to think, personnel that is, that masks didn't affect therapeutic outcomes as much, but kind of intuitively that might not seem the case, but that's not what their data, at least at this point, reflects. And I think part of it is kind of tied into the lack of sort of racial and ethnic diversity in the trials that I was looking at, because people in minority groups probably were more affected by COVID negatively and probably had access to less resources to overcome that, whereas most of the participants in the trials were probably from more privileged groups that were somewhat insulated from some of those negative effects. And yeah, there was differences between the sites in terms of, and within sites, different individuals thinking that masks would have negatively affected patient outcomes and like therapeutic outcomes to varying extents. But as far as I could tell, and some of these trials weren't finished, but as far as I could tell, that wasn't really reflected in the data, and yeah, not to a significant extent. So that kind of contradicted my initial hypothesis that it would have been a big kind of burden on some of the outcomes of these trials.
Thank you. Now we'll kind of rotate back to Hannah. There was a question in the chat that says, in designing a clinical environment for psychedelic assisted therapy for bipolar 2, how would you envision for it to be safe and effective for bipolar 2 specifically? Are there models that would already work for it? And if not, how could it be designed for adaptive outcomes?
Yeah, so the way I would envision kind of creating a safe and effective clinical trial for psilocybin in bipolar 2 patients would be to focus on risk management. So maybe potentially having the day of a screening for hypomania and hypomanic symptoms to see kind of where the patient is in terms of potentially being in a mixed episode where they would be experiencing depression and hypomania together. And if that's the case, maybe saying this might not be safe to proceed with a psilocybin treatment session at this time. I think that would be one way to kind of screen patients that day of, to kind of make sure that they're only experiencing symptoms of depression. And in addition to that also making sure that there's, the psychiatrist and the other staff member present who are trained on maybe crisis management in case something does go awry during a treatment session. Yeah, I think those two are probably where I'd start with.
I have another question for Hannah, and then maybe we can go back around. So you mentioned that the typical treatments for bipolar disorder sometimes can have negative side effects, and that's why something like psilocybin might be a hopeful option for people. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how typical bipolar treatments work. So you show kind of the diagram with the moods going up and down. Do they work to kind of more, I guess, lower the amplitude of those fluctuations so the mood is stable over a longer period of time? Or do they focus more on like the depression episodes versus the manic episodes? And then kind of a follow-up question would be, how do you envision psilocybin working? So do you think it would mainly just treat the depressive episode, and that would be in contrast to how the typical medications work? Or what was your line of thought around that?
Sure. So to answer your first question, the way that typical medications work right now is there's mood stabilizers and antipsychotics that are typically used to treat bipolar disorder. And each specific medication is kind of researched into either depression or hypomania, or sometimes they can be used to kind of level both sides of a mood. So some medications really only focus on helping with depressive symptoms, and others really only help with hypomanic symptoms. And there's a few that kind of are believed to kind of help with both. But the way that these medications work is that the goal is kind of to prevent episodes, but that's not always super realistic, and kind of how it really happens in reality. A lot of the times they don't really prevent episodes, they just damper episode intensities. So instead of completely getting rid of depressive symptoms, you might have symptoms to a lesser degree that are more manageable and not as disabling than you would if you were unmedicated and not taking anything at all to help with these symptoms. And then to answer your second question, I think psilocybin would be really helpful and mostly with the depressive symptoms. There isn't any research that I came across when preparing my talk they would help with the hypomanic episodes, but the way that bipolar can sometimes work is that you would have like a hypomanic episode followed by a depressive episode, or vice versa. They kind of bounce off each other. So in theory, it might work that if you're treating the depressive symptoms with psilocybin, you might not really get as many hypomanic episodes just because you're dealing with the depression, and that's in turn not triggering any other type of episode.
Okay, yeah, that's really cool. So then do you think that psilocybin would really work better for bipolar 2 versus bipolar 1, just because the hypomanic episodes would be more easily, I guess, abated by treating the depressive episodes?
Yeah, I think to a degree. I think just generally speaking, mostly what I researched was bipolar 2, and in bipolar 2, it's kind of known more as the depressive heavy bipolar disorder, versus bipolar 1 is sometimes more manic heavy. So that's why I was kind of focusing specifically on bipolar 2 for my talk, is because it is more depressive heavy, and there's so much research going on right now that's kind of indicating that psilocybin can be used to treat, major depressive disorder. So I kind of extrapolated that to potentially treating depression in those depressive heavy bipolar patients. I'm not quite sure what the thought is in the community right now for treating bipolar 1 patients with psilocybin. I think there's more risk there with bipolar 1 patients having full-on manic episodes versus just hypomanic episodes. So I think there's a little bit more risk there that would be a bit difficult to navigate in putting bipolar 1 patients in a clinical trial with psilocybin. But yeah, that's a good question. I think that's something to really look into.
Thank you. Really interesting stuff. I guess I'll just snake back through. So go back to Jeremy. So here's a question. So when you spoke about clinical psychologists at the beginning, that some of your background research that they from what I gathered, they seem to have more of a negative attitude towards psychedelics than healthcare practitioners. And this is kind of the opposite of what I would expect. For some reason, I would think that maybe clinical psychologists might be more open to these kinds of treatment than physicians and doctors. But I was just wondering, do you have any insight as to what would lead different occupations to have different attitudes towards psychedelics?
I think the temporal component is definitely a big thing, and I couldn't tell you what year like those publications correspond to in my literature review. I'd have to look back, but I think my inclination is that the clinical psychologist study was probably one of the earlier ones, and it was looking at clinical psychologists across the board in like a non sort of psychedelic context, whereas I think the healthcare workers study was looking at like palliative care and specifically using psilocybin to alleviate some of the like end of life anxiety, and so it was potentially a more like focused or specific use of psychedelic assisted therapy. I'm as for your question, I think it seemed like there was some level of lingering like misinformation and stigma, or at least a little like hesitation towards embracing the treatments across different professions. But I would tend to agree with you, like probably at this point in time, it seems like clinical psychologists might be best poised to kind of embrace this as a new like treatment. Yeah, but I think maybe just like the discourse in different professions and where they're getting their information from, whether it's from like research or media, like popular media, and those things can all influence how they think about psychedelics and how they might be helpful.
Yeah, it sounds like we just need a whole new, more updated round of research so that we can get more accurate viewpoints now that the tide is kind of a little bit turning culturally.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
I
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I also noticed we have Janelle too in the attendees. So Janelle can hopefully join our live Q&A. And then I guess, yeah, while she's joining, we can, Maya, there's, a question for you about, that says, like you said, studies are still being completed about the effects of psychedelics on de-differentiation. Do you expect different psychedelics to have different or similar effects? For example, might the serotonin 2A agonists, such as psilocybin and LSD, have similar effects versus dissociatives like ketamine?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I really like the recent Trends in Cognitive Sciences review that's done by Gurn et al. Was published this year. They kind of come at it from a complex systems perspective. And it's going to be like a combination of both, like maybe there's some general patterns between different substances, but then also so much of how psychedelics affect de-differentiation, or even like your brain networks, are going to be dependent on who you are. And then also the context that you're taking the psychedelics in and the experiences you're having. So there's so much complexity. It's hard to say like that paper kind of goes over kind of some of the pitfalls of like thinking of psychedelics, of having like these neural correlates of like different brain network interactions and effects. So I would say it's definitely like a balance between maybe some patterns and associations between different substances, and also it being more context and experience dependent. Also, is it okay if after this question I kind of revisit the question you asked me earlier? I have like a little bit more to say, if that's cool. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. I was curious about what sorts of like contexts you do think then might be leaning themselves more to like de-differentiation in a therapeutic sort of sense?
Ooh,
And probably highly variable as well.
I imagine like synesthesia, right? I imagine that that is probably associated with some sort of like, and when I was preparing for this talk, I was kind of looking to see if there's any research on it. I didn't stumble upon any, but I didn't go too thorough also. Like especially in sensory networks, that there probably is some level of dedifferentiation associated with the experience of synesthesia and stuff like that. That's kind of something I can think of off the top of my head. Does that answer?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Go ahead and circle back.
Yeah, so I reviewed some of my notes, and it is mTOR is heavily implicated in Alzheimer's disease because as both a potential like modality for therapy, but also a disease marker, because whenever you inhibit mTOR, it can increase autophagy, and this autophagy can help eliminate some of the plaques and tangles that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. And psychedelics, their like specifically psilocybin and LSD, they exhibit neuroplasticity through an mTOR dependent mechanism, and they activate mTOR. So my mentioning of that in my talk, and also I think what Dr. Olson was getting at when he mentioned it in his paper, was that in somebody who is already developing Alzheimer's pathology, further activating mTOR could actually worsen this pathology. And so it's hard to say for sure because there isn't any actual research on it, but it's just a potential mechanism that could be harmful to people with early Alzheimer's disease, and is part of why I'm arguing for more robust cognitive measures to be used in this population if we're going to be administering psilocybin to them. But also I'm so new to cell and molecular biology. So like if there's any inaccuracies that I said, please let me know. I'd love to learn more.
So I think for Jeremy, there's a question. Privilege was the theme of your talk. Do you think, for example, social workers who see people of lower privilege than, say, clinical psychologists, do you think that could impact how they view psychedelic treatment?
Definitely, yeah. I think there's probably like a large interplay there between the providers and who their clients or patients are, and how that shapes how they think about treatment, and how like a big part of why I wanted to do this project is if we're developing these treatment models based on clinical trials and there's no there's a lack of diversity in clinical trials, then when these treatments are actually rolled out, they're not going to be benefiting everyone in the same way. If minorities weren't considered in the clinical trial process, or this was designed to best help a certain group of people, then it's not going to be able to be optimized for everyone in the long term. So I think it's important to get that data and on attitudes and perceptions early on, so that we can better inform like how we adapt and apply the models that we're using in clinical trials to treatment in the future.
You. I don't know where Janelle, like she's in the chat. And I do feel like she should get some questions. So Janelle, if you are in the chat, please feel free to respond. There's a question, had you taken psychedelics just before even adding any supplements in? Did you notice like less adverse effects or more positive effects when you did take the supplements before a journey? And could you sort of like elaborate on those differences? I think I'll give like a bit of time for them to respond. But I guess there's a short question in the meantime for Hannah too. Do you think microdosing would be effective for treating bipolar 2?
I think that's a great question because there's been a lot of discourse about microdosing lately in the media, and I think it's got a lot of people interested in psychedelics, specifically in microdosing, but I'm not too sure about how beneficial it would be for bipolar 2. Most of the research I did was looking at specific clinical trials focused on a more sizable dose of psilocybin in a controlled clinical environment. And I think that's where it might be difficult with microdosing, is that if something were to go a bit awry in taking the psilocybin in a microdose sense, then it wouldn't be in a controlled clinical environment, or perhaps one could design a clinical trial where you do microdosing and are in a clinical environment every day for 5 days in a row, similar to how TMS treatments can sometimes be done for major depressive disorder, where they can do a specific protocol where you're in clinic every day for 5 days in a row receiving treatments, and they're very short treatments. So that could be something to look into. But yeah, I'm not too sure. I haven't delved too much into microdosing and kind of the mechanics behind that at all.
That's really interesting. I think there can be like substantially different effects from microdosing versus macrodosing, obviously, but I don't think it's really a matter of just, like a microdosing is like a miniature version of a macrodose. I think it's going to end up turning out that it's completely separate effects, that by taking this sub-perceptual dose that you're really, your brain is doing something completely different than this whole full-blown psychedelic experience. It looks like we have another question for Maya. So a big theme of your talk was that, of course, we don't have enough research to know whether or not psychedelics are going to be effective in treating dementia, but the potential is there. So years down the line, I'm assuming that research will be done, since this is a burgeoning field. But what do you predict? Which drug do you predict will be the drug that will be more effective in treating dementia?
That's really tough. I think there's so many mechanisms to consider when trying to make a prediction like that. And I'm honestly not even sure if psychedelics will be used to treat dementia further down the line. Yeah, that's really tough. I don't know. Honestly, I don't have an answer. Because there's just so much to consider, and so much that hasn't been like researched, so much data that's not there yet. But that's a great question, and one I'll definitely be thinking about as the years progress.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure one of them will prove to be, some sort of, I don't want to say miracle drug, but something that is helpful for dementia. So we'll see.
There was a recent clinical trial that seems really promising on, I think it's donanemab or something like that. I haven't looked too deeply into its mechanism of action, but yeah, I agree. Hopefully there's something that comes out that's helpful.
Yeah, and if not one of the, classical psychedelics themselves, maybe some sort of drug that's derived from one of them.
Yeah, or even like a combination of two different drugs. Maybe like, I don't know, if you just off the top of my head, if you combined rapamycin with psychedelics or something like that. So like you prevented like, I don't know, you blocked mTOR while also like inducing neuroplasticity through other pathways. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea.
I don't know as much, like I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm like still, yeah, curious because I think, I don't know if you mentioned or I just like already knew this, that like dementia and like Alzheimer's and all of these things are diseases of despair, and they've been increasing in prevalence, like that it just cannot be explained by anything except the environment. So I envision that like the sorts of treatments that we'll need will also can't be just psychedelics. Like it would have to be other things of like our lifestyle changes and like nutrition especially. So do you see sort of like any connections between these different types of potential treatments and how they may synergize? Like any combinations you think are interesting?
Oh, definitely. There are definitely like systemic critiques that can be made here just by looking at who's affected by dementia based off of like being a minority increases your risk factor of getting dementia. So yeah, like it's hard to, I guess, say which per se. The lab I'm working in currently is kind of trying to answer that question in a way. Just taking a shit ton of environmental and lifestyle data, and also taking neuroimaging data in a longitudinal sense, just to see how your brain networks change in relation to your lifestyle and stuff like that. But I still think there's so many questions. Sometimes the answers are very simple, is like giving people the resources they need to live, like food and access to cognitively stimulating activities, and not living in areas that are like polluted and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely think that that's important when it comes to dementia. Did that answer all of your question, or were there parts that I missed?
I think that was, yeah, that was a complete answer for me. Thank you.
Okay. Cool.
Well, I have a couple of questions for everyone. So maybe we can just go through everyone to answer these again. So just in general, in terms of your interest in your research topic of interest, are there any unexpected risks associated with your topic? And what are some of the really big unknowns that we should be aware of? I guess anyone wants to start off, and then we can popcorn it to the other two speakers.
I can start off. In terms of unexpected risks, in the context of my project, I think clinical trials, at least the ones, the teams that I visited, were very like risk aware and wanted to be attentive and cautious around, like some of the potential risks and how they can streamline the like process to avoid those or mitigate against those. And so I think there wasn't necessarily anything that was unexpected. Obviously, there are some risks there, and I think like their studies were designed to account for those. But one thing, unanswered questions, the second part of your question kind of resonated with me, because in a lot of the conversations I had, it was evident that there's a big incentive or a desire to really standardize the process of clinical trials to ensure like scientific rigor, and that can and does end up with not optimizing individual patient outcomes in a lot of cases. And obviously that would be the goal down the line when we're actually treating people, would be to maximize those positive patient outcomes on an individual level. But it's not necessarily the primary goal in a lot of these trials right now, because it's more important to maintain the kind of rigor of the study rather than what's always best for the individual. And I think that can be like problematic. But yeah, I also see the value in it, and I see like why that's the case. And then in terms of the study design, there's like so many other things that go into psychedelic assisted therapy, like the music, the environment, the therapist, therapeutic approach, and so many other variables that aren't always accounted for. And I think it's important to try and parse them apart from just the drug effect. And I think future research will benefit from kind of trying to isolate those other factors and figure out what can really optimize the therapeutic effects of psychedelics, and then hopefully that will lead to better outcomes in the future.
Great, thank you. Hannah or Maya?
I can go next. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, for sure. So just kind of in general, what are some of the unexpected risks associated with your topic, and what are some of the big unknowns? I know you kind of mentioned some of them in your presentation, but if you wanted to just sum it up and add anything else that you can think of.
Definitely. So I'm not sure. Unexpected risks is kind of hard to pinpoint because this is such novel research that it seems like all risks are kind of unexpected or unsure of, because this is just something that hasn't really been studied too much. But I think one of the biggest risks would be either the participant having a bad trip per se during the dosing session and having a really bad experience that might negatively impact their mood or make their symptoms of depression worse. So that's a risk that is associated with taking psilocybin in this patient population, just kind of in general. But another risk I think would be that I kind of talked about in my presentation was the risk of putting a patient from depression and giving them psilocybin and that flipping them into some sort of manic state, which is also not kind of what researchers and clinicians would want to happen in this patient population. So I think that's something that really researchers and clinicians really need to be mindful of when designing clinical trials or trying to treat patients with psilocybin. And in this patient population, something that they really need to be mindful of, because there is that unknown of kind of what this will do to that patient's mood. And I think it really is variable from patient to patient, and kind of the other risk factors that that patient may have, like comorbidities of other illnesses or certain traumas or past experiences that might impact how they respond to psilocybin in this specific type of treatment. That is very different from, you know, taking a mood stabilizer every day. It's very different. So it's hard to say how a patient might respond to that with psilocybin and kind of the dosing environment and such like that.
Thank you. Maya?
Yeah, so just to clarify, you're asking about some of the unknowns and the risks, right? Okay. So the big unknown, of course, is that there's no actual research on how psilocybin affects the cognitive functioning of people, or LSD too affects the cognitive functioning of people with dementia. I would say the biggest risk right now is that, like a study like the Johns Hopkins study, which has a 6-month follow-up and is not taking rigorous cognitive measures. I would say the biggest risk factor is that study shows success in treating the depression of people with dementia, or early onset Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment, which is like an early form of dementia. But somewhere down along the line, maybe a year or two, they might show just reduced cognitive ability than they would have had they not taken psilocybin or something like that. I mean, it's impossible to know whether that'll happen or not. And I think it would just be cool in general just to know, like, just to, like, to have the data on what's going to happen, because I mean, it could improve cognition, it could help them down the line, but we just don't know yet. So I would say the biggest risk is that people aren't testing for the potential interactions that psychedelics might have on cognitive decline that could be negative.
That's very true. Okay, thank you all for that. I have another general question. So some of you may have touched on this in your presentation a little bit, but what do you envision the next steps of your research being? And what would your dream study be if you had no limitations? And I guess we can go in the same order. So, Jeremy?
Okay. Are you asking about next steps for research specific to this project or like in general?
You could talk about both if you like. That I'd be interested in both.
Okay. For this project, I would like to publish a paper on the results and also analyze all the qualitative data from the interviews that I conducted and that I haven't got to yet. So that's sort of the long-term plan, is to combine this quantitative data with the themes that come up in the interviews and hopefully get that published. But I'm also at a bit of a transition point in my life, like just graduated college and I'm about to start work at the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. So that's a really exciting opportunity for me. I haven't had a ton of like clinical experience and exposure, and that's what I'm really looking forward to, and also continuing to develop research skills and experience. But as I kind of go into that next chapter in my life, I'm somewhat putting this project on hold until I can figure out how I can fit that into my routine and yeah, figure out like what form it's going to take. But that's the long-term plan. And then remind me what the second part of your question was about, like a dream study, right?
Yeah.
That's a tough one. There's a lot of interesting unanswered questions. And maybe circle back around on that one for me.
Yeah, I know. It seems like if with unlimited resources, there's just too many options. It's hard to decide. But yeah, we can circle back around, and congrats on your new position and good luck.
Thank you.
Hannah?
So the next steps that I would like to see in the psychedelic research community surrounding my topic would be to start establishing more research on psilocybin and treating bipolar 2 depressive symptoms, either through like animal models or through clinical trials. Kind of, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are some places in the US who are performing clinical trials on the specific patient population with psilocybin. But I'd like to see more robust studies done and kind of gathering more data via clinical trials for that. And I think my dream clinical study would be pretty much looking at what I described in my presentation, taking a depressed patient with a history of bipolar 2 who is currently in a depressive episode and having psilocybin administered to them in a controlled clinical environment with specific supports in place. And in addition, follow-up visits would have some therapeutic element to them so they could continue working on what psilocybin kind of set the groundwork for, and kind of treating depressive symptoms in tandem with psilocybin and therapy afterwards.
Cool. I look forward to seeing your future paper. And Maya?
So I would say the next steps, I would hope that, I don't know if it's too late for the study to make these alterations, but I would hope that they would improve their cognitive measures to one that's used in other trials looking at cognitive interventions for people with dementia and early Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment. And I hope that they would have a longer follow-up. So I hope that there are clinical trials and studies that are designed kind of considering that psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD will likely interact with cognition in some way, and just kind of preparing the study to gauge those. So seeing how taking psilocybin when you have mild cognitive impairment will affect your cognitive outcomes in 2 years or 3 years or so. And having a larger study enough that where you could actually start to make conclusions regarding those associations. And I would say my dream study design probably like interacts with like what I think future directions should be or could be. I would say, because regarding future directions, I know that there are some clinical trials in the work, and there's a lot of different startups and different companies that are patenting different types of psychedelics for the use of psilocybin, or for the use of treating these disorders. And I would also, on a side note, I would hope that people who are advertising psychedelic therapy would kind of stop trying to say that they could treat dementia or mild cognitive impairment until we have like actual data, just because, I mean, this is a very vulnerable population, and I feel like there may be some potential for exploitation there. And so, but my dream study design, I would probably say like unlimited money, like a 10-year longitudinal study where you give one group psilocybin and another group you don't give psilocybin, like a active dose, alongside therapy and stuff like that too, because they probably have comorbid depression, which is really common in this population. But also utilizing functional neuroimaging and a PET scan, the type of PET scan that is designed to look for Alzheimer's pathology, like plaques and tangles, and then kind of doing that maybe like every year or so. And then also incorporating some sort of like daily cognitive activity measures, just to see if that acts as a mediating or moderating variable in some of these associations. Because like some sort of like daily assessment that they can take on their phone about their cognitive activity, or something like that, just because there might be some associations of like if you take psilocybin when you have mild cognitive impairment and you do nothing, then maybe that could be bad. Or if you have mild cognitive impairment and you're constantly challenging yourself with difficult cognitive tasks on a regular basis and constantly learning new things, then maybe psilocybin could have a positive effect. And I think just being prepared for those associations and just designing the study that way would be really cool. But yeah, I love that question. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, we have one more question for everyone, and then we'll roll into our closing ceremony. So Jeremy, I'll cycle back to you. You can either talk about your dream study if you've thought of one, or it's kind of related to this question. So just feel free to talk about whatever you like. But the question is, what do you hope the future of psychedelic science will look like? So just the field of psychedelic science in general.
So I did have an idea about dream study. Like one thing that came up in a lot of my conversations for this project was sort of the clinical setting being potentially like comforting for some, and also potentially like not as comforting for others, and that kind of stands in contrast to some of the traditional uses of psychedelics in naturalistic settings. And so I'm interested in some study that compares like a naturalistic setting or like nature as a mediator of some of the therapeutic effects of like psilocybin, for example. And I know like some like institutions are kind of moving in that direction and like trying to have a controlled setting that's still a little more integrated with like nature or like the outside kind of natural world. So I'm interested to see like if we move away from the more like clinical, hospital settings, or how that will evolve. I'm just curious about that, and maybe that'll be something that develops in the field of psychedelic science. But I think the main thing is probably just more like bigger studies with bigger sample sizes and more potentially more streamlined design, so that we can compare results better and have more like objective measuring sticks with which to compare studies. And then I'm very curious to see how it'll develop, but I don't think I'm in a like good position to predict like how it's going to unfold, but I'm here for the ride. So
Cool, thank you. Hannah?
So what I hope for the future of psychedelic research is first widespread acknowledgement from researchers, clinicians, and kind of just the general public of the potential that lies in psychedelics for treating illnesses and health conditions on a clinical level. I think there's been a lot of stigma attached to psychedelics over the past 50 to 60 years, and I think that's really been harmful and detrimental to the study of psychedelics and the applications that could exist for treatments and other treatments for health conditions. And I think that's really negatively impacted the field of medicine specifically. So I think just people acknowledging that these are not bad substances and that there's a lot of potential in these for treatments, and kind of seeing it more from a medicinal point of view versus something very stigmatized and negative.
Yeah, I agree. And Maya?
I love this question. I hope that psychedelic science prioritizes more, and these are hopes that I am a bit pessimistic about whether they'll actually come true, but I hope that it prioritizes more equitable access, more diverse samples, is data-driven, anti-capitalist, and prioritizes the voices, experience, and perspectives of Indigenous groups so that they lead this movement. And then I also hope that psychedelic science is less about helping people survive and perpetuate an eco-suicidal culture, and more about transformation and helping us survive, and also becoming aware of how our lifestyle is causing harm to people all over the world.
I love that vision. We lied. There's one last question that I wanted to ask you guys. This is an interdisciplinary conference, of course, like you guys got to interact with everything from like chemistry to like network neuroscience and culture, music, all of this stuff. So this is sort of like an integration question that I hope you guys start to think about after psychedelics is over. But what is the like wildest or most like disparate, like most surprising field, topic, technique, design outside of your own field that you see potentially incorporating in your research moving forward? And are there any collaborations in particular that you look forward to? May require some thought. But I can start with Jeremy.
all right. Yeah, it's a tough question. There's definitely a lot of opportunity in the interdisciplinary nature of this field. I think like one sort of macro level thing is like art and science coming together is really cool. And I think with some of the stuff I was talking about earlier with like the music and the setting and like how the room is designed and things like that, like how could things that are more on the art side be incorporated and optimized to really bring the most benefit out of the scientific treatment that's going on. So I think given the history and culture of like surrounding psychedelics, it's a really unique and interesting like field to allow those things to come together. And yeah, I'd definitely be interested in learning more and incorporating more sort of arts-based elements into future research.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I was thinking kind of art and neuroscience as well, but specifically for the presentation I talked about, looking at music and how that might impact like a dosing session, like depending on like what kind of music you play during someone's dosing session, like classical versus rock versus pop, kind of seeing like how that might influences someone's like mystical experience and how that in turn might lead to different clinical outcomes.
This is a really tough question, but it's a really great question too. The best thing I could think of is, it's not exactly related to psychedelics, but the longitudinal study that I'm currently working on, we're incorporating some, like, we're working with the physics department to collect like air pollution data around the city. And just kind of combining some of that, because they have placed like sensors all over the city, and they collect data on like what kind of air pollutants are in the air, and just kind of incorporating that kind of data with how that affects people's brain health and stuff like that.
So cool. A lot of art, a lot of science, and even some public health. That's really exciting. Thank you guys for answering that question. Hopefully you guys think about it more over time. And yeah, Erin, I guess I'll, give the floor to you to start the closing.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you three so much for being here, for all your hard work, putting together the talks and answering the questions, and best of luck. We hope to see you around.